The war ended in 1945. The celebrations happened. The treaties were signed. The soldiers came home. The world moved on. But in a jungle on the Philippine island of Lubang, 10,000 miles from Tokyo, one man kept fighting. Not because he was abandoned, not because he was forgotten, but because nobody had given him the order to stop. His name was Hiroo Onoda. He was a Japanese Imperial Army intelligence officer. And from 1945 until 1974, 29 years after the war ended, he waged a one-man guerrilla campaign from the jungles of Lubang, convinced that the war was still ongoing, convinced that every piece of evidence telling him otherwise was enemy propaganda designed to lure him out. To understand Hiroo Onoda, you need to understand the world that made him. Onoda was born in 1922 in Kainan, Japan. He grew up in a culture where military service was not merely a career, it was a calling. Where loyalty to the emperor was not merely expected, it was the defining purpose of a life. In 1942, at the age of 20, Onoda enlisted in the Imperial Japanese Army. He was selected for intelligence training at the Nakano School, Japan's elite military intelligence academy. This was not ordinary soldier training. The Nakano School trained its graduates in something specific and deliberate: survival behind enemy lines, psychological resilience, the ability to operate without orders, without supply lines, without contact for extended periods. Students were taught that surrender was not an option, that a true soldier fights until he receives orders to stop, and not one moment before. Onoda absorbed every lesson completely. In December 1944, 2nd Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda was sent to the island of Lubang in the Philippines. His orders were explicit and would prove, in ways no one intended, to be almost supernaturally binding. He was never, under any circumstances, to surrender. On August 15th, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's surrender to the nation. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor's voice. The war was over. Hiroo Onoda, deep in the jungles of Lubang, heard none of it. By the time Japan surrendered, Onoda's unit had already been scattered and largely destroyed. Most of his fellow soldiers had surrendered or been killed. Onoda, with a small group of holdouts, eventually, reduced to just 3 men, retreated deeper into the jungle. In October 1945, American and Filipino forces dropped leaflets over the jungle. The leaflets carried a simple, clear message: the war is over. Japan has surrendered. Come out. You will not be harmed. Onoda read the leaflet, and he concluded it was enemy propaganda. This conclusion was not irrational given his training. The Nakano School had specifically prepared its graduates to expect exactly this kind of psychological operation, fake surrender announcements, designed to draw out hidden fighters. So he kept fighting, and for the next 3 decades, no matter what evidence arrived, and evidence kept arriving, Onoda found a way to interpret it as confirmation of the war's continuation rather than proof of its end. Try to hold in your mind what 29 years actually means. In 1945, when Onoda retreated into the jungle, World War II had just ended. Harry Truman was President of the United States. Television was a novelty. The atomic age had just begun. By the time Onoda emerged in 1974, man had walked on the moon. The Vietnam War had ended. Japan had become one of the world's leading economic powers, rebuilt from the ashes of the very war. Onoda was still fighting. He knew none of it. Life in the jungle was not passive waiting. Onoda and his dwindling band of holdouts conducted active guerrilla operations. They raided local farms for food. They fired on Filipino police and military patrols. They sabotaged equipment. One by one, his companions fell. One surrendered in 1950. One was shot dead by a search party in 1954. His last companion was killed in a firefight in 1972. By the early 1970s, Onoda was the last holdout. alone, in his 50s, having spent essentially his entire adult life in a jungle war that the rest of the world had closed the book on 30 years earlier. The Japanese government and Onoda's family had not forgotten him. Search parties had been sent. His family had traveled to Lubang. Loudspeakers had been set up at the jungle's edge, broadcasting messages in his parents' voices, telling him the war was over, begging him to come out. Onoda evaded them all, not because he didn't hear them, but because he had been trained to treat exactly these kinds of appeals as sophisticated enemy deception. The more convincing the appeal, the more suspicious he became. In 1959, Onoda was officially declared dead by the Japanese government. And then, in 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki decided he was going to find Hiroo Onoda. Within days of arriving on Lubang, Onoda appeared, not to surrender, to investigate the intruder. What happened next was one of the strangest encounters in the history of military conflict. Two men, one a middle-aged soldier still fighting a 30-year-old war, one a curious young traveler sitting in a jungle talking. Suzuki couldn't convince Onoda the war was over. There was only one thing, one single thing, that would bring Hiroo Onoda out of that jungle. A direct order from his commanding officer. Norio Suzuki returned to Japan and reported what he had found. The Japanese government located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now living quietly as a bookseller, and asked him to travel to Lubang. On March 9, 1974, in a jungle clearing on an island that had been the entire world for one man for 29 years, Major Taniguchi stood before Hiroo Onoda in full uniform and delivered the order that should have come 3 decades earlier. He ordered Onoda to lay down his arms. The mission was over. Onoda complied immediately, without argument, without breakdown, without visible emotion. He stood at attention, received the full order, and obeyed it exactly as he had been trained to do. Japan did not know what to do with Hiroo Onoda. He was, technically, a hero, a man of extraordinary discipline, loyalty, and survival. The Japanese public received him with honor. He was celebrated. He was famous. But Onoda himself was struggling with something nobody had anticipated. He could not forgive himself for the people who had died because of his campaign. The Philippine government, to their extraordinary credit, pardoned him for the killings that had occurred. During his campaign, acknowledging that he had genuinely believed himself to be at war. But Onoda carried the weight of those deaths regardless. He eventually moved to Brazil, where he ranched cattle for years before returning to Japan to run an outdoor education program for Japanese youth, teaching survival skills and, in his own way, trying to give something back. He died in January 2014 at the age of 91. Hiroo Onoda's story is not really a story about stubbornness or delusion or a failure of communication. It is a story about what happens when a human being commits completely, utterly, without reservation, to a set of beliefs and orders, and then the world those beliefs were built for simply ceases to exist. He did exactly what he was trained to do. He followed his orders precisely. He never broke. He never surrendered.